Scott Stokes. I was an advisory solution architect with Mongo for 5 years. I moved over to the enablement team, I guess about 9 months ago, because it just seemed like a good thing to do, give a little back to Mongo as a whole. So this is gonna be really informal. I didn't have a ton of slides, so just a couple to kind of set the stage of what we're doing. So if we look at kind of the trends that we're seeing from a customer perspective, the trend is definitely towards serverless applications. I mean, everybody's heard of AWS Lambda, Azure Functions, et cetera, microservices, cloud-native applications. And it's kind of surprised me. I mean, I spent 15 years as an IBM solution architect, doing on-prem stuff with WebSphere. I spent 2 years at Oracle. And I remember the sentiment back then going, none of the real companies are going to go to cloud. Well, fast forward about 10 years, 20 years, and now everybody is moving to the cloud. Even some of my stalwarts that swore will never be public cloud are now in public cloud, except for one. Not my current customers, but all those guys are moving there. So if you look at the way developers are building things now, they're building things around serverless, because most companies that get out into cloud, and they think, okay, great, we're going to do lift and shift. Just put everything in one region, and then they find out how expensive it is because they didn't kind of count for scale. So then they want to scale it, or they have an outage and they lose that region and they go completely down. I've had it happen with a couple of customers now. So then they start trying to figure out how to go multi-region. Most of them take some type of serverless type approach, so serverless functions, that kind of thing to get stuff out there. And developers need to integrate their data into their applications kind of in the same way. So what MongoDB has done, now there's several ways to do this. I'm going to talk about 2 of them today. So one is the data API, which basically is pretty much a zero configuration type thing. You make the, you go into Atlas, you make a couple of entries, you generate an API key, and you're done. You can then go and start just issuing Mongo statements through a serverless API. It'll scale up and scale down. So basically, I mean, it's just a package that's coming out there saying, hey, what action do I want to go? What's the data coming in, the database, the collection, et cetera, and then your authorization keys. Goes to Atlas and comes back with your responses. So very easy to have a interface for your applications. It is serverless, so you don't have to define servers or quantities or any of that kind of stuff. It will scale up and scale down to meet whatever your demands are. Security is built in, so there's a lot of different ways to secure it. And you can define lots of different routes, so I mean, it's very flexible how you can configure and deploy it. There are no connections maintained, so that's one of the things to realize that when you're not maintaining a connection, there's a few milliseconds of overhead as you issue that REST call and get the results back. And this will also work with Atlas serverless instances. So, is anybody using Atlas serverless today?
Atlas serverless?
Yes.
No. Okay.
So, I mean, we just announced this I think 2 years ago. It's GA now, but so with Atlas, you define your servers, right? How big the VMs are, M10s, M20s, that kind of thing. But we also have something now called serverless. So you don't define your servers. It will scale up and scale down to meet whatever your demand is. The only thing you pay for consistently is how much data is stored, because we have to pay the cloud providers for that. But you can work with that with serverless, scale up, scale down, handle whatever you want. And we think this is going to be a trend for a lot of companies going forward, particularly if they've got a lot of really small customers. So I've had several clients that they had hundreds and hundreds of really small customers, right? So they went through jumping through a lot of hoops trying to put them all into one cluster, to one database, or have a collection for each customer. There's all sorts of things they tried, because if you look at just the value of one customer, they weren't paying enough to justify a dedicated cluster. But they could do something with that with serverless. They could scale up and scale down and not have to worry about dealing with that. All right. So we did, talk about security. So the same typical things you see today in Atlas. I'm going to be using an API key today, but you can integrate with JWTs, email passwords, kind of whatever you want there. It still does use role-based access controls, and the IP access list is in place, so it allows client requests from things inside the access list. All right, we're not going to talk about those. Do y'all have any questions on authentication and that kind of stuff? I wasn't planning on covering those, but we can talk about them if anybody has questions.
I would think Gary can a bit more on that.
Okay, so authentication with Atlas, there's a couple of ways built in. So the typical user ID, password, email, password, that kind of stuff. We've gotten some additional things for API keys. We also integrate with LTPA tokens, so JWT type stuff as well. I haven't gotten into that. To be honest about it, I'm one of those guys that says, security. I know somebody who knows that. Hang on, I'll get him for it. So I try to avoid security because it just frustrates the ever-living out of me. And by the time I figure it out, I don't need it again for another year. So I try to avoid the in-depth security stuff, but I can talk at a high level about most of it. But all the typical authentication mechanisms you have with an Atlas are still there today. So, integration with LDAP. I've got customers using, what does Azure call their? American uses it. What's the Azure?
Active Directory.
It's an Active Directory interface to Azure Data Directory Service or something like that. ADS, I think, is what it's called. But anything that can present an Active Directory interface, we can interface with as well, as long as it's standard. Kerberos fits into that category as well. We support most of the cloud provider authentication, native authentication mechanisms. So IAM is part of AWS. I forgot what some of the other ones are.
I thought you could also, like, if you're doing, say we're doing AWS, so we're doing a VPC link.
Mm-hmm.
So we have our own dedicated hub, correct? And we have our own data atlas, and we're saying, look, we want to connect to our VPC in AWS.
Right. You have Atlas gives you a dedicated VPC, and then on your cloud side you have another VPC. So you can either do VNet peering, or every cloud provider does it, but they've all got different names for it.
So it's auto-magical that you don't have to worry about that if you have those two connected.
Well, just because you got the connection, you still have to worry about authentication. Because the connection just lets the network go through.
Yeah, if you're going to expose your Atlas to your front-end customers, correct?
No, something good. I mean, whatever your application is, it's got to authenticate with Atlas.
Yeah. The application authenticating to it, but not like a front end to your customers, like you.
Your customers themselves probably won't sign in. You'll probably have your own authentication mechanism for that. But at the application layer, usually there's a different layer of authentication that occurs for that. Some people, like I know at American, they wanted to integrate with single sign-on with the browser and that kind of thing. So they were having to go through Active Directory and that kind of stuff to work. So they authenticated once with their browser. It worked that way with the applications. I think they were passing that authentication through the back end as well.
Fun fact, we just got that set up today for SSO with Ping ID.
Oh, nice. Yeah, and third-party providers like Okta. We use Okta internally, Ping for American. There's a couple of others that name slips in my mind at the moment. Oh, well, there we go. Okta, Auth0, Cognito, Azure Active Directory. There's a whole slew of them now. And you can see from those, this is a list. I think there's some more at the bottom we haven't got through yet. But, I mean, you're trying to authenticate with that list. There's very few ways I've seen a customer ask for that we can't support. Okay, so one of the other cool things about this, and I can show you guys this as we set this up, is for a demo, I'm going to go through and actually set up the data access API so you can actually see the steps to go through. It's really simple. But one of the things you're going to have to do as you set up the access is go through and define role-based access control. So I'm going to set it up wide open, but you can set it up with anything you can basically imagine. So if I'm authenticated, let's say my authentication mechanism gives me a particular role, like a manager, an employee, something like that. I can actually filter the results you're allowed to see back from the database based on your role. So if you were to connect up straight out through that same role, and you can connect up through this as well, like through either through your application, web applications, that kind of thing. If you say, select, give me this document, I'll only get the fields back that I'm allowed to see. And you can say they're allowed to see all these fields, they're not allowed to see these fields, they can update certain fields, they can't update certain fields, I can hide things based on your role. And the authentication mechanism involved strips all the data out. So they only see what they're allowed to see. So I could, in theory, have a bunch of fields that you're only allowed to update if you're a manager. But you can see them all because you're a customer. But maybe Britton's a service rep, so we don't want him to see all your details of credit cards. He can just see your address and service records, that kind of thing. All right, we'll see that. If you've dealt with Atlas before, you've dealt with the IP whitelist, so I've already got that set up, I hope. All right. Custom endpoints, we're not going to dig into that. So let's go through and take a look at how we set this up. Wrong project. This one is a black project. I've just got I've got one M0 cluster set up. So this is, if you're not familiar with an M0, there's no cost. There's no credit card. It's free, totally free, no credit card, nothing involved with that. And I did install the sample databases, so we can have some data to work with. So for Data API, you simply click on the left-hand side. Before I do that, let me check and make sure I've got this IP address listed. Current IP address. Okay, there it goes. All right, so it's working on getting it in place. There we go. All right, so we'll go to the Data API. Now notice all I've done here is created a project and an M0 cluster and loaded the sample database. So you're going to see exactly what we have to do to go through to set this up. And it's really straightforward. So the first thing is to select your data sources. I'm going to say select them all. So load demo is the only one that's out there. Enable data access. And of course, this is where Atlas will decide to be slow on me. There we go. All right, so what kind of access do we want to give it? Notice we have the here. So you've got the endpoint. This is what you would use in your applications when you're doing your curl command or HTTP request, whatever. What kind of access do I want to give to this? We're going to do read and write for this one. Now to connect up, we're going to have to create an API key. So that's the big one here. We'll just call this demo. And then you have your API key. So one thing to note about Atlas API keys, if you haven't done this before, they give you the key one time. You need to copy the key and keep the key. It will not let you see it after you've created it. So you get it this one time. If you need to do it again, you'll have to delete the old key and create a new one for it. It's not a big deal, but just realize that because I didn't realize that when I was doing it for myself. And so here's a curl command to actually go get the database. And notice this already got our API key in it. So what I'm going to do, we're going to copy this. I'm going to go over to Microsoft VS Code. Create a new one. All right, so we got the current curl command. Our collection name is collection movies. Database is Apple_Inflix. And we'll just get the ID. And let's go ahead and get the title as well. All right, now if everything has worked properly, we should be able to execute this. So let's see what it does. Nope. Oh, I'm sorry. My bad. All right, we got all this done. Nope, that should work. Fetching the data sources. It takes it a minute because behind the scenes, what it's doing is actually creating an Atlas. We used to call it Realm. We call it Atlas Application Services now. So it creates an application services project, and that takes a few minutes to get created and deployed. So we'll give us one more second. I do have a working one just in case. Nope. All right. So let's do a fallback. I've got the same thing I did earlier this morning. Just leave you guys.
Do you want to debug it? That's
No.
you learn the most when you debug.
If you've done enough demos, you always have a backup plan because doing live coding and debugging in front of an audience is never fun.
That's not a real demo unless it breaks.
Yep.
Exactly. Okay, so now we're getting data out of that, and we can, let's pipe this to clean it up. Oops. Three. See, I told you I get fat fingered. There we go. Okay, so now you can see more of a pretty result on it. This is just getting the underscore IDs and the emails from the users in that same collection. And at the very top of this, there we go. So what you'll get is an array of documents, called documents, and then whatever result you told it to give out. Now, if we look at, so I'm going to make this a little bit bigger so you guys can maybe read this. Here we go. All right, so if we look at the curl command we're giving, or the curl command itself, if you look at the HTTP endpoint, right at the end there's an action slash something. So you can use pretty much all of the same operators you do in the Mongo query language. So find one, aggregations, all of those things work here. So that's one of the really nice things about this API. A, I didn't have to define much of anything. And B, I've got the full power of the aggregation pipeline behind it. So I can do anything I can do in MQL. And it's a lot more than you can do with other mechanisms. So for example, let's see, I've got one here.
I have a question. Do you know if so they have Java API, Java libraries and stuff like that. Do they all just indirectly use this API that you're using now? Or is it another way that they're accessing?
If you're doing it through Java, you're probably using the MongoDB driver. We have native drivers for all the languages. And what it does is it acts as a driver to connect to MongoDB and issue your queries, but when the data comes back, it's in native constructs for whatever language. So when you get the Java driver, it's going to give you native Java objects. If you're using it in Python, it's going to give you dictionaries and those kind of things you're used to. So it makes the interface with Mongo much more friendly for whatever developer is developing the language. This one, however, is really good if you're doing, let's say, Python scripts, or if you're doing command line scripts, something like that. Reach out to Mongo, get the data I need.
But they're not using a serialized Java object and then deserializing it. It's still coming back as JSON, correct? And then turning into that Java object?
It's come back as BSON, which is binary encoded.
Binary? Okay.
Right. So it comes back as binary. The driver encodes it into constructs that are native for whatever language. So if you're in JavaScript, you're getting JSON back. If I'm in Java, I'm getting POJOs back, essentially.
Okay. So there is a very small but a possibility that, and it might be that you could use it if you wanted to troubleshoot. You're saying, oh, why is this happening this way? You could use this call and see if you get a different result and know that it's might be in the BSON or something like that. Would that be safe to say?
You could. I mean, where I see this one working, mostly is people doing Python, where they don't want to drop into the native Mongo stuff. They just want to issue a REST call and get it. Because if you really break this down, all this is doing is a simple HTTP request. Right?
Oh,
so some developers just want to do a simple, and all that is a curl command. And me personally, what I've used it for is just scripting. So if I'm collecting information in a Mongo collection, I'll just go out and run one of these commands, get this stuff down. If you notice, I typed it through a query called JQ there at the end. That lets you rip and kind of change JavaScript around, or JSON around. So
the power, I think, with this, for me personally, is that there's a lot of developers out there that understand REST. If you know REST and you know JSON, you know Mongo, right? Using the data API, those developers are now very productive. They can put data in a database and query it, right?
Yeah. So what I was saying is we have the Java developers and they're using obviously, but maybe they think, oh, it's not my code, must be the driver or something. You can say, well, here, go use this. Hey, you got back same result. It's your code, or so, you know what I mean, like this.
I can tell you it's their code before they ever got to that level. I've seen these Java programmers. I love them.
But or any coder, but that's what I was just thinking of this, like different use cases for this. So that would be, I think it's very powerful. Like that's really
this is a really good use case. I mean, mostly for me, I'm using this in situations where I'm doing scripting, right? Or maybe somebody, I'm already calling a REST API. I don't want to mess with native Mongo stuff. We could do it this way. There's also other ways to do it. I mean, I can expose a REST endpoint. I can build a REST API inside of MongoDB in Atlas in Scratch in under 5 minutes, guaranteed. I'll show that at the end if Karen doesn't show up, because it's super easy to do, and it's serverless. It scales with your application, so you don't have to worry about any of that stuff as well.
So we got to ingest data for ETL and other stuff from another data source that can help out in that way. Yeah.
You could. Oops. All right, so I did build not really a complex aggregation here, but this one is just going through I don't know how many of you guys have been through the Influx database, but it's kind of like movie reviews and that kind of thing. So what year they came out, what genre they're in, or genres, the actors, the producers, that kind of thing, awards. So what I was doing with this one is I just want to give an example of doing an aggregation. So the only difference is I say I've got a pipeline, I want to go through, I want to group everything. The key on the I'm grouping by, which is called underscore ID in a group by stage, is the year. So group by the year. For each one that you find in there, I want you to add 1 to the count. Then we're going to sort, descending from count so we can find the biggest one. We'll limit to 10 items. So let's flip back over to this guy. We'll make the font a little bit bigger so you guys might be able to see what we're doing. So there we go. Influx database. 2013's got over 1,200 movies. 2014's got 1114. But all of the major operators supported as part of MQL can be supported by this API. Now, the one thing I would point out, the other one I'm going to talk about is GraphQL. Anybody here using GraphQL today? You don't count, and you don't count. Nobody's using GraphQL? Anybody know what it is? All right. So GraphQL is kind of cool. Britton thinks it's great. My jury's still out on it, to be honest about it. But what GraphQL is, it's a common way of interfacing with the database. So you can just, the application programmer making calls to the database can affect what query is run, what the results look like. They can do joins, they can do inserts, those kind of operations as well. And that's all great and good. But when you really look at it, the approach that's taken there is kind of a least common denominator approach. So I can only do a subset of the things I can do in MQL. And that's why I like the data API a little bit better if I were doing that. So let's go over here and look at, we're going to add services. This is how you would add additional things in. Now this cluster was clean before I came in here. This one was actually created when I created the data API for the other application. Let's go through and we'll create a new app. All right, Karen's here.
Sorry.
Hey, Karen.
Karen, I broke my demo. You can fix it for me?
I brought my IT guy.
Oh, sweet. All right, so what I did here, I just created an application service project over in application services. We'll just tell it to create. I've connected it up to the M0 demo, so the same data that we're using. This will take just a couple of seconds. Okay, so when you do this, it's going to give you a couple of things. So this one is really cool. Device sync, if you're doing mobile applications, it can work with the Realm mobile database, and it will sync automatically between the data on your mobile device and what you have in Atlas. So if I make a change in Atlas, it comes to the mobile device. If I make a change on the mobile device, it goes back up to Atlas. Anybody here been to 7-Eleven? Karen has. Everybody's been to 7-Eleven. All their store inventory runs on this, thanks to a lot of effort from Britton. So I'll give him the kudos. That's pretty cool. You can also set up triggers. So if things happen inside the database, I want to call a function if something happened. I can set up REST endpoints. There's a web SDK, so I can make calls directly to MongoDB from my JavaScript application. So React is the one I typically use. But today we're just going to do a quick GraphQL. And of course, all these guides are going to mess with me here. Okay, so here's, I told you I want to set up GraphQL. It kind of cuts off the far side. But this is giving me the steps I've got to go through. So we're just going to start with that. First, we're going to configure a collection. So we're going to link to a data source. So it failed to fetch data. Let me go back real. No, I don't want to do that.
Keeps on the same.
All right, this one is killing me.
Oh, is it, are we in the app already? Oh, okay.
I was going to see if, let me make sure, I thought I set network access for this. Click my current IP address, we should be good.
Because like linked data sources, sometimes I went on one see under manage and the linked data sources, sometimes that's
Where are you talking?
So go down to manage on the left menu, all the way down to the green manage, and then underneath it, linked data sources. So is that correct? Okay, then.
Yep.
Then forget.
That one is there. Well, the one that's showing walking me through setting up the. All All right, so that is working now. Let's try this with creating a new project from scratch again, just to see if that one will go cleaner. What I wanted you guys to see was how it walks you through setting all this stuff up. All right, so we'll create a new app. We'll just call this working. Keep our fingers crossed. We've got this one connected.
This is idle.
I think so. We'll go to the guides. We want to create a GraphQL. All right, so we'll get started. First, configure a collection. We'll go next. Define the roles. Kind of walks you through everything. So we'll go through the collection itself, which is up here. Which collection do we want? We'll go against Flex Movies. There we go. And I'll read all. We'll add a preset role. So this, remember before I was saying you could define roles to allow people to read or write or just read or write some fields. This is the way you would go through and do that. And all I did was pick up a default one, so anybody that comes in at this point is going to have these accesses. I could go through and add additional roles defined by fields in the document. So if my user ID has got a principal ID in it, let's say I've got the same thing in the document, I could identify them as the owner. So they could do certain things, maybe change fields, whereas everybody else can only read them. All right, so we've got that one set up. We've got the roles in place. New draft to deploy. All right, 2 seconds. And now we need to go through GraphQL and generate a JSON schema. Now, this is one of the things that really kind of turns me off to GraphQL. I have to actually generate a schema to match my documents. So with the data API, I don't have to generate any schemas. It will change depending on the documents I'm getting back. So it's very dynamic. And to me, this is kind of a holdover from the SQL type philosophy as part of this. So we'll go through and just have it create one for us. This one, at least it worked this afternoon. We'll define a schema. We'll just say generate from a default sampling. He's going to come up. So if you notice what he's doing here is identifying all the different fields, what type of data are in them. It's a VSON type of string. So wind is an int, et cetera, et cetera. And these are, oops. This one worked fine before. We'll run a validation just to make sure that it's a valid schema. No errors. So we can just go through and save this. Draft, and then review and deploy.
Do you have a question back here?
Yeah, that was curious, because if you have a collection, and what I've always been told or what it goes is like, oh, you can add another field, it's just a different version, and you're good to go, yada, yada, yada. Well, I just saw you say, hey, do a validation. It said, I'm going to sample 500. That's
to make
the whole
sure
thing. What if you added? What if your 501 piece of data is the one that has that extra? You're not going to get that in your GraphQL. Will it affect the Will GraphQL still work if you add another field?
I believe GraphQL will still work if you add another field. It's just expecting that particular data type. And if only the fields defined in a schema are the fields that are accessible from the endpoint that's using it.
From the GraphQL. So it won't.
I can effectively hide fields here.
What?
I can effectively hide fields by doing this.
Yeah, because you could remove some of that. Okay.
Correct.
Yeah. So it won't affect it in that way.
All right. Yeah, it won't. As far as I know, Karen, do you know any? Make sure I'm not lying. Okay. So what I thought we would do is give you an idea of what GraphQL looks like. So this is a simple, very simple one. All I did was click on GraphQL. It'll bring up like this test client. It's got a very, very simple query field in there. It's going to bring back one document. So let's just click on play. All right. So we're getting a document back. The nice thing about this, if I just want certain fields, this is very easy to do. A developer does not have to learn MQL. They don't have to learn SQL. They wouldn't have to learn whatever database language is behind it. They could just learn GraphQL. Good and bad. So let's just limit this. Let's get rid of some of these. Title. We'll run it again. So now you can see it stripped the document down to much smaller. So this test client, I'm not going to, I didn't go through and build it into an application. I think Karen actually had something. Didn't your stuff do in GraphQL? Or you didn't
Do
start?
a lot of GraphQL. I actually have a talk to give it open source next week on GraphQL. So I'm taking notes right now.
Well, don't use what I'm doing because mine doesn't work. But the nice thing about this, in the test interface here, it has full context awareness, so it'll go through and inspect the GraphQL schema that we generated and go through and let you see the fields that are out there. So poster, runtime, writers, I can pick whatever I want. Let's go Metacritic score, run it again, and now we can see it's added Metacritic, which didn't have anything in it. So that in a nutshell is GraphQL. You can do the same types of things. You can do joins, you can do inserts and deletes, those types of things, but it's its own little set of syntax, and it's not quite as flexible as any of the native database type query languages, so MQL, SQL, any of those. This is just a least common denominator.
Yeah. I just want to make a comment on it too. So data services, that's MQL, but you could do MQL in that. You could do anything with the data services. So data services is the most powerful way to get in, the data service API. But for new developers, you can create the application services. And that's where you have the REST calls. So REST and JSON, developers who understand that can be effective day one. And then GraphQL gives you the ability to do mutations, inserts, updates, deletes, everything through the same endpoint. With REST, you'd have to define an endpoint for each one of those. This is your insert REST endpoint. This is your delete REST endpoint. This is your update REST endpoint. And then write all the code behind it. So that's why I like GraphQL. He's right. The other MQL is very powerful. You can do anything you can do, aggregation services, everything. But for developers new to Mongo, this is a great way to get started.
But if you put actor, is there a field called actor in there for
Yes.
the movie right now?
Mm-hmm.
So if there's a field that we don't
Well, it's
have,
called cast.
let's say launch date. Does it have launch date? So say we have a new field we want is launch date.
Last updated? I don't have launch date, but I got last updated.
But you can in regular Mongo, you can just add launch date to that collection and it would start supporting it.
You can, and you would update the schema.
You would have to update
You
the
would
schema.
have to update the schema.
Yeah.
But if you added that launch date right now and didn't update the schema,
Yeah.
the GraphQL wouldn't be affected. It wouldn't get the data back either.
Yeah.
Okay, and you couldn't query on it, so GraphQL just doesn't know about it.
No.
I think so. So if you go into that query button underneath the Document Explorer, one of the things I really like about this in the Documentation Explorer on the right side is that it'll show you the fields that are available. So yeah, I'll go and write, and then you see this tab says query and then query. So click on one of the queries. So it should show you, and then click on movie query input, I think, and it'll should show you all the different fields. I always get kind of confused, or maybe, yeah. So it'll show you all the different fields and how to query it. So I used to work at, I'm deeply in love with GraphQL. If Sevan and I were, my husband and Chris will have children, I'd probably name them maybe our next call would be named GraphQL. Because I used to work at Twitch, and my title was an integration engineer. And we used to, if you're familiar with Twitch, people stream themselves playing video games. So there was this idea of the person who would stream, and then there was the video game, and then there were the people following. And so we created this really rich set of REST endpoints where you can find anything about the user, and then we kept trying to give more and more information about the user, which was another headache because there's all the permissions and stuff from the user. And so anytime, we tried to make it simple by having fewer endpoints, but then we just gave out more and more data on it, which would really bloat payload for whoever was making these calls. And it was just a really sort of complicated way of building this network. We could make one call, take an ASIC, get the results back, just get some data from it, make another call. The cool thing about GraphQL is not only do you get to get only the data back that you want, so we showed one collection, you could make connections to other collections if they're linked by like an underscore ID. If the username in one thing means something else in another collection, you could link those collections, so you can get data that's linked. And the other thing is that you can create a custom resolver, which is probably out of the scope tonight. So a custom resolver can hit other endpoints or get other data or run aggregations. I use in GraphQL, I use custom resolvers to run an aggregation to do do search, Atlas search inside of it. So I'm making all these complicated, what should be complicated, but they're actually quite easy once you set it up in GraphQL. And I can change all that, and it all uses the same endpoint. So I can simplify my payload, the endpoint never changes, and it's one network call versus all these different kind of asynchronous network calls. So it really gives you a lot of freedom with one thing. We have lots of different ways of connecting with this. Just a few good examples of GraphQL.
And there's actually a company called Apollo. They make a GraphQL gateway, which I know one of our large customers, one of the large Dallas-based airlines uses that extensively. And they, so they connect to all sorts of different databases, and that gateway is actually doing some of the resolutions. Like it should be joined across different GraphQL providers, us being one of those. So it's got its uses. It's just, architecturally fits in. It's just, to me, if I'm just focusing in on a single database, I'm probably not getting as much power out of it as I could. But to Karen's point, it's very easy. If I've got a document with 1,000 fields in it, and the developers only need 5 or 10 on average, stand up a GraphQL endpoint. They can use that to get only the fields they need and not spend the time and incur the latency penalties of transferring all additional data if they don't.
And it's good because you can have all these fields, and now you're held to it as a back-end thing. That's your contract. You have that very good, vast amount of data that they may or not know need to use. So then you have all these clients, and you're sitting there like, well, how do we know if we're going to do this for this field? Well, just go to all the different clients. They're doing it in all these different ways. Definitely you will be able to remove that field just like that. I mean, you're talking seconds. You can remove it. You won't affect anyone because you have all these clients. They're all using it. So really the contract now is like, as soon as you put it out there, you don't take it away because you have all, you don't know the usage. You have to go through every code base and every developer, client developers that said, yeah, I need that field, I need that. No, I don't. Is that correct? Is that the only downside? That's the only downside.
I'm not sure. If you specify a field and I take it out of the schema, does it come back as null after that? I've never tried that.
If I take a field, if I ask for a field that doesn't exist,
In the schema.
why don't you put
Try
your one?
Sure, be logical about it.
Sorry.
She does this to me all the time. Well, you could just try it. Open up the
Acting like
console.
there's nobody here.
You actually have to do something, Scott.
Let's try looking for a field with Karen rules.
I
We'll
think
do
this
that.
is- I think it complains.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, it says I can't get Karen's rule.
So yeah, if you took a field out of the schema, you
Right,
break
yeah.
the line.
So essentially what GraphQL does is allows you to, whatever data you return back, that's the contract and you're done. You're not, you don't have to really plan. You just say, here's the kitchen sink, do what you want to it, and we'll keep that kitchen sink on all the time. It puts the power into the client, but then it keeps the client control. So that the back end now is pretty much stuck.
So basically, if you want to remove a field, you remove it from the client, right? Is that
Which one? I have about 100 of
you have
them
100, which
with
number
thousands and thousands
Yeah,
of
that's
lines
true.
of code.
That's right, but the one
Your
number
manpower
99,
to do that is
number 99 doesn't want that field because it's eating up network bandwidth. So number 99 changes his GraphQL query, but the schema stays the same for all the other 100 customers, right?
I think he was talking about if you take it out of the schema.
No,
Yeah.
you cannot. That's what I'm saying.
Well, you
want-
can. Then every application that breaks,
Yeah,
you
yeah,
that's what I'm saying. That's where you're getting at. It's a really big thing. It changes the aspect.
Yeah.
It puts it on now.
The client
That is essentially all the multiple clients are the consumers and the controller of all of that, and the back end is really just this data pipe of just data that's just there all for the rest, which hey, it can work. I mean,
Yeah, if you don't want the fields, just remove it from that particular client. And it's query. You just use the query on the client, but you never change the schema. Or if you did, you'd be additive only. You add new fields.
and then you update the schema, and you add that other piece. But like even the date. So like if you had like a day or you do something the way you're changing it, you would have to. They would have to
So
compensate for that.
That
too.
whole argument was why they took required fields out of Protobuf 3. Google took it out because he said if you think about it, You can never have a required field that you add suddenly while everything's in production, and you can never remove a required field. So we're saying that no fields can be required. But that's an argument that's been made forever. I like this because it's the schema. Live with it. If you don't like the field, don't query it. So, pretty
Well,
cool.
I mean, it's just like any of the other technologies. You just need to understand the pros and the cons of it, and what fits best in your environment. Because if I'm a small development shop, this is probably overkill for me. If I'm American Airlines, it's probably not overkill for me because I can save a lot of money by that, that data egress charges just by getting them the 5% fields they want instead of 1,000. So it's really just kind of an architectural decision of what fits your use case and your organization the best.
Well, you're putting the power also more into the front end development.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Like you create it for them, they take what they want.
All right,
Do you have anything else on that presentation?
Oh, that
Or
was really good.
That's pretty much it. The one thing, you have a demo?
Yeah, I got something. I
Okay.
mean, it's okay.
Come up here and get set up, and I'll show you one other thing real quick, because I think it's only take about 2 or 3 minutes. But building a REST API on top of MongoDB just using app services. This is a really cool thing. So for example, I'm just going to create a really simple function for this. We'll just call it test. Oh, they changed the interface on me.
Where are we? Did you
I
start
was
with
going.
the?
I just started with a function.
Well, why don't you start with the
HTTPS?
endpoint? Yeah.
Okay. We'll discard that. Okay.
So
So we'll just add a real quick HTTP endpoint called.
I think you have to start with a / or something.
So I'll just defend Scott for a second. These guys change the interface all the time. I don't know why. They're worse than Windows. Like they move
Make it
everything around.
easier for you.
They do it to mess with me. I know they're all after me.
It's still there. You just get to play like an Easter egg. Let's find it.
You just gotta find
Where
it.
they put it. Oh, they hid it over here. That's so clever.
Don't worry.
There.
Yeah.
That's the two I always miss.
If we miss it, then-
Developers has already filed a ticket because he was going there and he's like, where the hell is it? And he was quite pissed.
Exactly.
Then when he found it, he's like, I can't put that down as I'd wasted this much time.
Yeah, exactly.
So in his day.
But why do
He's
they
a
do
direct, he's a good,
I don't know the interface developers if they get off on that. I mean, do they like to waste people's time? Do they do it to torment people? Why change it? I mean, it works fine. I don't know what process they have.
Somebody's got to earn money by making things pretty. All right, so what I've done here, I'm defining an HTTP endpoint, so just an endpoint to support it. What I had to go through and tell it was basically that we're going to do a GET, because I forget to do that when it's expecting a post. It's going to expect a result back. It's going to come back with JSON. We're going to wants to call a function, so we're just going to create a new function, right? And we'll call the function test, and hopefully they still give me, okay, cool. So one of the nice things is, when you're doing this, and this is why I like this approach. I'm a control freak, because I was a software developer, and that's kind of the way I think all developers are. We want to control stuff. If you want the ultimate flexibility of what your endpoint is doing, this is one of the best ways to do it. It's serverless, and down here I've got complete JavaScript. So I can do anything I want. So for example, we wrote something for an internal product that we were using for one of our teams. And when we saved a change to the document, it took the document that was there, saved it off into another array called old versions, so that if they decide they want to revert back, we already have the old version. We just flip-flop them and change it back. All of that was done here. You just call one REST API saying, here's the new version, here's the new version, here's the new version. But it was keeping the last 10. So things like that are very simple here. All right, so I'm going to make this one really, really simple. Oops, scroll down, I can see the bottom, there we go. So we're just going to comment these out. And so that one is say, hello, Karen. Okay. Let's make sure I didn't make any mistakes. Okay, it's coming back with hello, Karen. Awesome, great. So now what we need to do is down here, where's save draft.
They have to deploy it. They added that too. That was another thing they added.
You can disable it.
You can. You can how?
You don't know.
Okay.
she's like $10.
So now I was talking, was anybody taking time? Was that, what, 5 minutes even with all the discussions? Right? Okay, so let's get where's the URL? Oh, here's a curl one. Actually, let's use
Yeah,
this.
just grab that.
And we'll go to a new tab up here. Paste this in.
Hey, you said you had to have authentication on it, didn't you?
Oh yeah, go to the function. Again, go to the test function
Make it
in the side left, in the left panel. Sorry.
No,
This,
you've done this more than I have.
I drove
haven't
up,
done this in
I
months.
drove up from Austin and I was exactly like this in the car too.
She was telling you how to drive?
I was driving.
I was like,
She
Stefan, I
was
think.
instructing you?
Oh, yes.
That's it.
There we go.
Welcome to my world. My wife does the same thing, so.
I was like, oh honey, I think that car up there, they're just tapping on the brakes. You might want to watch out for that. I wasn't.
See, my wife does that, but she slaps like
I
the
was
side
like,
passenger door. Oh, and I'm like, okay, yeah, what is it I'm not doing anything I should.
Watch out! You're not paying attention! How
Exactly.
am I not? You haven't wrecked yet, have you?
All right, so there we go. Hello, Karen. I should have thank you, Karen. But this is fully scalable. It's deployed. I mean, you don't have to worry about any of the other Gorp that goes with it. So now I've got the basics of a JavaScript function. I can just go through and define whatever MQL, whatever actions I want. I've got full JavaScript there, so I can do whatever I want.